Mary Fisher never imagined that the end of everything would begin with a knock at the door. It was 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday in August 2004, in a remote town in the Arizona desert, when 3 men appeared on the doorstep of her wooden shack. The sun punished the desert with that relentless force that cracked the earth and dried up the watering holes, but the chill Mary felt seeing the face of George, her late husband's brother-in-law, was sharper than any icy mountain wind. She was 34, with 5 children clinging to her skirts and a 10-month-old baby in her arms. She also carried a grief too recent to name, because it had been only 28 days since Ronald, her partner, had been swallowed by the quarry in an accident no one bothered to properly explain. George wasted no time with condolences. He entered uninvited. The other 2 men stayed outside, hands on their belts where the rusty revolver butts gleamed. His voice was as dry as the ground he walked on. "Mary, you know how things are. This house is on company land. Ronald owed me $3,500. There's no way you can stay here. Pack your belongings before sundown and get out. I don't want any trouble." Mary tried to argue, but the words died in her throat when she saw that George had already decided everything. There was no room for pleading, no compassion in those eyes that were identical to Ronald's, yet empty of any humanity. It was like looking at a corrupted version of the man she had loved, a cruel shadow using the same last name to justify a betrayal that not even the dead deserved. The expulsion was methodical and humiliating. George's men threw her belongings onto the dirt road as if they were trash. The thin mattress where the children slept, the dented aluminum pot, the broken radio Ronald had promised to fix, the image of Our Lady of Guadalupe that had belonged to Mary's grandmother. Each object tossed onto the red earth was a trampled memory, a piece of dignity torn away. The children didn't cry. They just watched with that terrible understanding that comes too soon for the children of poverty. Daniel, the eldest at 13, clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white, but Mary held his wrist and shook her head. Violence would only bring more misery. When the door of the house Ronald had built with his own hands closed for the last time, Mary knew they were alone in the world. They started walking with no clear destination. The August heat in the Arizona desert is a living thing, a presence that presses on the chest and sucks the air from the lungs. Mary carried little Julia, who was burning with fever, wrapped in a tattered blanket, while the other 5 followed in a line, holding hands like a fragile chain against the hot wind that stirred up whirlwinds of red dust. Camilla, 11, held Gabriel, 7, who held Lucas, 5, who held Beatrice, 3. Daniel, the eldest, brought up the rear, turning his head constantly as if expecting someone to follow them, or perhaps hoping someone would call them back. The town, cowering under the power of George, who controlled the quarry company and half the businesses, closed its doors. Windows were locked when they saw the family approaching. No one offered a glass of water. No one opened their mouth to question the injustice. They were ghosts, erased from the map of the living by the stroke of a pen from a man who had forgotten that the blood running in his veins was the same that ran in the veins of the brother he had left to die in the quarry. Mary knocked on 3 doors. At the first, a woman who had been her neighbor for 8 years looked through the crack and said she couldn't help. At the second, a man yelled from inside for them to leave before George found out. At the third, no one answered, but Mary heard the low sound of a television and saw someone's shadow moving away from the window. They wandered for 3 days. The August desert heat offered no respite. During the day, the sun turned the dirt road into a burning griddle that scorched through the worn soles of their sandals. At night, the cold descended from the mountains with a cruelty that made their teeth chatter and bodies tremble. Mary had managed to save only 6 pieces of stale bread and a bottle of water that she rationed with obsessive care. giving the children a few sips at a time, moistening Julia's cracked lips. Hunger ceased to be a sensation and became a physical presence, a monster gnawing at their stomachs from within, making their legs tremble and their vision darken at the edges. The children stopped complaining on the second day. They just walked, putting one foot in front of the other, driven by a primitive instinct for survival that they themselves didn't understand. Julia worsened with each hour. The fever that had started as a gentle warmth had now transformed the girl into a small, frightening thing. All red and convulsing, her little eyes rolled back, her mouth open in a silent cry because she no longer had the strength to scream. Mary knew about childhood illnesses. She had raised 5 before this one, but she had never seen a fever so high, so persistent. She dampened the baby's forehead with the rest of the dirty water she had found in a puddle, but it was useless. The child needed medicine, fluids, a hospital, and Mary had nothing. The helplessness was a madness slowly setting in, a constant whisper in her mind telling her she had failed, that she was a useless mother, that it would be better if they all lay down there by the roadside and waited for the end. It was Camilla who saw it first. Late on the 3rd day, as the sun began to descend, painting the sky orange and purple, the girl pointed to the horizon with a trembling hand. "Mom, look over there." Mary lifted her eyes, too tired to feel hope. At first, she thought it was a mirage, an illusion created by dehydration and despair. But as they approached, the shapes became solid, real. It was a graveyard of rusted metal, 4 overturned train cars, and an old locomotive, all abandoned in the middle of a vacant lot that had once been the route of a forgotten railway. It must have been left there decades ago, perhaps since the days when they still tried to bring progress to the desert, before promises died along with the corroded tracks. The children stopped, afraid. The train cars looked like carcasses of giant animals, iron monsters dead and rotting under the sun. The wind whistled through the broken windows, producing a sharp, ghostly sound that made the hairs on their necks stand on end. Rust covered every surface like a red, scaly disease, and where the metal wasn't rusted, it was dented by years of abandonment and vandalism. It was a place of endings, of defeat, of dreams buried under the dust. But Mary, in that moment of absolute despair, saw something different. She saw walls that weren't the open sky. She saw a roof that would block the murderous sun of the day and the biting cold of the night. She saw a fortress against the wild animals that howled in the darkness. "Let's go," she said, her voice hoarse from thirst. "It's better than nothing." She dragged herself to the car that seemed least destroyed, one that still remained on the dead tracks, though tilted to one side. The sliding door was partially open, jammed by rust and time. Mary pushed with her shoulder, putting all the weight of her exhausted body against the metal. The screech was horrible, a sharp cry of protest, as if the dead train was being awakened from a deep and resentful sleep. The door gave a few inches, then a few more, until it finally opened enough for them to pass. The interior was a cave of shadows. The smell was suffocating, a mixture of oxidized metal, animal urine, dried bat droppings, and decades of mold. There was accumulated trash in the corners, broken bottles, dented cans, remnants of old campfires made by wanderers who had passed through and moved on. The metal floor was covered in dirt, dry leaves that had blown in through the broken windows, and something that looked like rat droppings. Light streaming through holes in the ceiling created pale rays filled with dust that floated in the still air. It was a tomb, but for Mary Fisher, in that moment, it was a palace. "Come in," she ordered softly. The children obeyed, Daniel helping the smaller ones onto the metal platform. "We'll be safe here tonight." Using a piece of soaked cardboard she found in the corner, Mary Fisher cleared a space on the metal floor. She gathered the children in the most sheltered corner, away from the broken windows where the wind blew strongest. She laid them side by side, using their own bodies to create warmth, with Julia pressed against her chest, feeling the fever pulse through her sweat-soaked clothes. Outside, the desert night fell like a heavy black curtain. The true terror began when the last ray of light completely disappeared. The train car was not a silent refuge. It was alive with sounds that shouldn't exist. The metal, cooling after the day's heat, groaned and cracked, creaking as if invisible bones were breaking within its walls. It was a macabre concert of snaps, hisses, and metallic sighs that echoed in the enclosed space. And then came the other sounds. The wind was not a gentle whisper. It was a howl that seeped through every crack, every rust hole, amplified by the hollow structure of the car until it sounded like the lament of lost souls. It seemed as if the train itself was weeping, groaning for all who had traveled in it and never reached their destination. And then came the animals. First, there was a single howl in the distance, then another, closer. Soon, a chorus of wild sounds surrounded the train car. They weren't just stray dogs, they were coyotes. Hungry and desperate like them. Mary Fisher heard them scratching the metal outside, sniffing at the cracks, their low growls vibrating through the floor. She saw their eyes, dozens of them, glowing like yellow embers through the broken windows, reflecting the thin moon that hung in the sky. They smelled weakness, sickness, vulnerable flesh. They smelled Julia. Mary Fisher sat with her back to the children, facing the darkness, with nothing but willpower between her family and the predators that gleamed outside. She prayed to all the saints she knew, asking that the rusted metal would be strong enough, that it would hold for just one more night. Dawn arrived, but it brought no relief. The weak gray light filtering through the broken windows and bullet holes in the ceiling revealed the true misery of their situation. The floor wasn't just dirty, it was covered in a layer of rust that flaked off and clung to their clothes, their hands, staining everything red as if they were bleeding. There were rat droppings everywhere, some fresh, and the acrid smell of ammonia burned their noses. In the darkest corner, Mary Fisher saw what looked like the skeleton of a cat or perhaps a skunk, the bones still covered in dried fur. The night's cold hadn't completely dissipated. The metal of the train car seemed to suck away any warmth their bodies tried to produce, maintaining a frigid temperature that made their muscles ache. The animals had retreated with the light, but their presence still permeated the air like an invisible threat. The children woke slowly, their movements sluggish, not from sleep, but from the hunger that was now on its fourth day. The hunger had evolved. It was no longer a sharp pain in the stomach. It was a deep weakness in their bones, a constant dizziness, a sensation of floating slightly above the ground. The younger children had stopped crying. They just sat with glazed eyes, staring into nothing, conserving energy they didn't have. Daniel, trying to be strong, trying to be the man his father had ceased to be, left the train car to explore the surroundings, returning 20 minutes later with empty hands and defeated eyes. There was nothing there, no fruit on the ground, no well, no abandoned crops, only dry earth, cacti, and death. Julia was worse, much worse. The fever hadn't subsided, it had increased during the night, and now the baby no longer cried, only made a weak, continuous sound deep in her throat, like a dying kitten. Her tiny body convulsed with uncontrollable tremors. her eyes half open but unfocused, her mouth agape, trying to pull in air that never seemed to be enough. Her skin was so hot it felt like it would burn, and when Mary Fisher tried to give her water, the child couldn't swallow, just let the liquid dribble from the corner of her mouth. Mary Fisher knew what this meant. She had seen fever kill before, had seen children taken in a matter of hours when the temperature rose too high and wouldn't come down. Julia was dying, and she could do nothing. Helplessness was a form of torture Mary Fisher never imagined could exist. It was worse than hunger, worse than exhaustion, worse than the fear of the animals. It was watching life drain from her daughter, feeling the tiny body grow lighter, weaker, more distant with each hour, and having nothing to offer but empty prayers and useless tears. She cradled Julia and sang lullabies that no longer had the power to console, moistened the baby's cracked lips with the last drops of dirty water remaining, and felt guilt crush her like a stone in her chest. She had failed, as a mother, as a protector, as the only thing these children had in the world. She had brought Julia to this place to die. It was desperation that made her stand up. She couldn't just sit there watching. If she was going to lose Julia, if she was going to lose all of them, at least she would go down fighting, doing something, anything. She looked around the train car with new eyes, searching for something she could use, some way to improve the situation. She noticed that the cold wind from the previous night had come mainly from a large hole in the side of the car, where an entire metal panel seemed to have been ripped away, leaving an open space directly to the outside. If she could cover that, at least the next night would be less cold. She had no wood, no tarp, but perhaps she could tear off another panel from the interior and use it to block the opening. She approached the inner wall of the train car. It was covered with thin metal panels painted a faded blue, now peeling and eaten away by rust, leaving brown and red stains that looked like open wounds. She tapped a panel with her knuckles. The sound returned hollow but firm. She tapped another, the same. She looked for one that seemed looser, more vulnerable. Her eyes, now accustomed to the gloom of the car, identified a panel near the floor that looked different from the others. The paint was more peeled there, and there was a thin line around the edge that seemed to be a joint, not a continuous weld. She knelt and ran her fingers along the edge. There was a small, almost imperceptible crack. She tried to wedge her nails in and pull, but the metal wouldn't budge. She looked for something to use as a lever and found a rusty piece of pipe in the corner of the train car. She jammed the end into the crack and pushed with all her body weight. The metal groaned, resisted, but didn't give way. Mary Fisher growled, frustration turning to rage, and hit the panel with the pipe once, twice, 3 times, with more force with each blow. The metallic sound reverberated through the car, startling the children, but she didn't stop. She hit until her arms ached, until sweat ran, burning her eyes, until the pipe slipped from her hands and fell with a clang. Gasping, she looked at the panel. There was a dent now, and the edge was slightly raised. Something had changed. She wedged her fingers under the raised edge and pulled with all the strength she had. She felt something give, heard a crack. She pulled harder, using her legs, arching her back. The panel moved, just an inch, but it moved. It wasn't just a lining. It was a cover. It was a secret door. With her heart beating so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest, Mary Fisher pulled again, and this time the entire panel detached from its hidden hinges, revealing a deep black compartment carved into the wagon's very structure. It was intentional. Someone had built that. It wasn't an accident of rust. It was a hiding place. Mary Fisher reached into the darkness, her heart in her throat, expecting to feel the bite of a snake or the legs of a spider. Her fingers touched something cold and hard. It wasn't an animal. It was metal. She grabbed and pulled, and what came out was heavy. Incredibly heavy for its size. It was a black metal box, the size of a shoebox, but 3 times heavier, with reinforced brass corners and a robust circular lock in the center. A strong box, a safe. Mary Fisher's heart soared and sank at the same time. It was a treasure, no doubt, but a useless treasure. It was locked, sealed, a cruel promise. She held salvation in her hands and didn't have the key. Desperate, she reached back into the compartment, fumbling in the dark, searching for a key, anything. Her fingers found more objects. She pulled them into the light. It was a small wooden toolbox, rotted by moisture, but its contents were partially protected by a rolled-up oiled cloth. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside were old but still solid tools, a carpenter's hammer with a cracked wooden handle, a set of rusty screwdrivers, pliers, a small chisel. And beside the toolbox, wrapped in leather, was another object, an antique, heavy brass binoculars. Its lenses fogged by time, but still intact. Mary Fisher picked up the objects and placed them on the ground beside the strongbox. She looked at them, trying to understand. Tools, binoculars, a locked box. What kind of treasure was this? The binoculars were useless here, good only for a better view of the desert that would kill them. The tools couldn't open a strongbox. Or could they? She looked at the hammer, at the chisel. They were heavy, real, solid in her calloused hands. She looked at the strongbox, at the lock that was its only barrier. She knew nothing about safes, nothing about breaking in, but she knew despair, and despair taught lessons. She picked up the strongbox and placed it on a metal beam on the floor to serve as support. She positioned the tip of the chisel at the tiny junction where the safe's door met its body. If there was a weak point, it had to be there. She raised the hammer. The first blow was clumsy. The hammer hit the chisel sideways. And the sound was a sharp, metallic clang that made the children jump. Daniel and Camilla raised their heads, watching their mother attack the metal object with a frightening intensity. They didn't understand what she was doing, but the sound was action. It was movement. It was different from the paralysis of hunger. Mary Fisher adjusted her position, aligned her shoulder, and hit again. This time the impact was precise, directly on the chisel resting in the lock's crevice. The sound echoed like a bell inside the empty wagon. The work was brutally slow and painful. The safe's metal was hardened steel, built to withstand explosions and violence. Each blow required a strength Mary Fisher barely had, a strength she ripped from a place within her she didn't even know existed, fueled by the image of Julia dying in her arms. The rhythm established itself. Raise the hammer, aim, strike. Raise, aim, strike. The sound filled the wagon, a metallic, relentless thump, thump that became the only real thing in the world. It was a scream transformed into action, a prayer made of iron and sweat. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, and the ray of light entering through the broken window slowly slid across the rusted floor, marking the passage of time like a cruel sundial. The inside of the wagon became a furnace. The August heat trapped inside the metal box rose to unbearable levels. Mary Fisher sweated so much that her clothes were drenched. Sweat dripped onto the safe, evaporating immediately on the hot metal. Her hands, already bruised from days on the road, began to blister where they held the hammer. The blisters burst, the skin broke open, and blood began to stain the wooden handle, making it slippery. But she didn't stop. The pain in her hands was almost welcome. It was a pain she could control, unlike the pain of watching her daughter waste away. Each blow wasn't just against the safe, it was against George, against the quarry that killed Ronald, against the town that turned its back, against God who allowed all this. It was against the whole world that had conspired to destroy her family. The sound became part of her. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of her heart beating. It was the sound of her refusal to give up, not while she still had arms to raise the hammer, not while Julius still breathed, however weakly. Julius' fever continued, relentless. The baby's whimpers were almost inaudible now beneath the pounding, but Mary Fisher heard them anyway, echoing inside her head. At each interval to rest her arm, she crawled to where the baby lay and moistened her lips with their last water, whispered nonsensical words, promises she couldn't keep. Then she returned to the safe and started again. Thump, thump, thump. The chisel was making a mark now, a deep line in the steel around the lock. It was working. Millimeter by millimeter, blow by blow, she was breaking through. And then, as the sun began to set and shadows lengthened inside the wagon, Mary Fisher heard a different sound. It didn't come from the safe. It came from outside. It was the sound of engines, of pickup trucks approaching at high speed, kicking up clouds of red dust. Her blood froze. The hammer stopped in midair. The sudden silence was total, broken only by the roar of the engines growing louder, closer. And then a voice she knew too well shouted from outside, "I knew I'd find you here, you wretch!" It was George, and he wasn't alone. George got out of the pickup truck with the agility of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted by force. His two henchmen emerged from another pickup, both armed, their faces covered with scarves against the dust. But George's eyes weren't looking for Mary Fisher. They were looking for the train. He knew. He had spent years searching for this abandoned railway, following the legend the old men told in the taverns. The story of the pay train that transported a colonel's fortune from a remote town in the Arizona desert during times of family violence, which never reached its destination. The train that vanished with everything inside. And now, seeing Mary Fisher kneeling with tools in her hand before a safe, George knew the legend was real. "What did you find there, Mary Fisher?" His voice was falsely calm as he walked toward the wagon. It wasn't a question, it was an order. The two men positioned themselves, blocking the only exit, hands on their revolvers. George climbed the metal steps and stopped at the entrance, his shadow covering Mary and the safe. When he saw the strongbox up close, a slow, ugly smile spread across his sun-baked face. "So it was true, and you, a simple woman, thought you could keep this? This belongs to me, Mary. Get out of the way." Mary slowly raised her eyes. Sweat plastered her hair to her face. Blood dried on her hands, and her eyes, hollowed by hunger, burned with something new. The fear was still there, cold in her stomach, but covered by something harder, something forged in the last hours of suffering and struggle. The woman George faced was not the submissive widow he had driven out a week ago. She was someone who had spent 3 days in hell, who had heard her daughter agonize, who had fought against iron with her bare hands until she bled. She was someone who had nothing left to lose. "No," she said. Her voice was low, hoarse from her dry throat, but it had the firmness of the wagon's metal. George laughed, a joyless sound. "No?" he repeated, as if it were the funniest thing he had ever heard. He pulled the .38 revolver from its holster, rusty but functional. "Mary, don't waste my time. You've been enough of a nuisance already. Give me that box and get out of here, or stay and die with these children. It's all the same to me." The men behind him laughed. It was routine for them. Just another problem being solved the way they always solved them. "What's in here?" Mary said, slowly standing, placing her body between George and the safe, "is for my children." She held the hammer in her right hand, the iron head pointing to the ground. It wasn't a weapon against a revolver, but it was all she had. It was the tool she had used to fight for them. She wouldn't let go now. George stopped smiling. He raised the revolver, but didn't point it at Mary. He pointed it at the corner where the children were huddled, specifically at the bundle of blankets where Julia whimpered almost silently. "Get out of the way or I'll kill her first. Choose quickly. I'm losing my patience." White, absolute terror seized Mary. He was going to kill Julia. He was going to shoot a sick baby just to prove he could. Her legs trembled. The hammer almost fell from her hand. She was about to give in, to fall to her knees and beg, when a sound cut through the tense air of the wagon. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the metal creaking. It was a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from beneath the floor, from the entrails of the earth. George froze, his finger hesitating on the trigger. What the hell is that? His eyes searched for the source of the sound, confused, diverting from Mary for a crucial fraction of a second. Beneath the wagon, in the dark space between the dead wheels and the parched earth, something stirred. In the preceding days, the children had explored that area, digging holes in the cool shade beneath the metal to escape the unbearable heat. They had dug near where the tracks created a kind of natural tunnel in the embankment. And in that tunnel, they had found someone. It wasn't an animal. It was a man, or what was left of one. A homeless man who had made the abandoned train his home so long ago that no one could say. His clothes were rags, indistinguishable from the dirt that covered him. His gray beard descended to his chest in a tangled mass of knots, and his hair was a nest of dirt and dry branches. But his eyes, deeply set in dark hollows, still gleamed with a strange lucidity, a kind of organized madness of someone who had lost touch with society, but not with immediate reality. The children, in their innocence and their own desperation, had shared with him the roots they found, the small creatures Daniel managed to hunt, the dirty water from the puddles. To them, he was just another hungry being, like themselves. They weren't afraid, and the old man, in his silent dementia, had accepted their presence, had become an invisible guardian of his territory. Now, hearing the threat in George's voice, seeing the danger to the only creatures who had shown him kindness in decades, he emerged from the darkness. He crawled out of the hole like an animal, on all fours, covered in dirt, unrecognizable as human at first glance. In his hand trembled a rusty kitchen knife. The blade, serrated and crooked, but still sharp enough to cut. He didn't speak, didn't scream, just advanced with that animal growl vibrating in his chest. George turned startled and fired instinctively. The detonation inside the metal wagon was deafening, a thunderclap that struck everyone's eardrums and filled the air with the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. The old man stopped suddenly. His crazy eyes widened in surprise. He looked down at the red stain blossoming on his dirty chest, then looked at Mary as if to apologize for not having done more. Then he fell forward, the knife scraping the ground harmlessly. But that shot, that explosion of violence contained in the small space, did something miraculous. The vibration traveled through the metal floor, a shock wave that shook everything. It reached the safe. It was the final push the lock needed. After hours of being tortured by Mary's chisel, after hundreds of blows that had cracked the internal mechanism, that violent jolt was too much. With the echo of the shot still reverberating in the iron walls, the heavy safe door opened on its own, swinging on its hinges with a slow, deep creak, like a sigh of surrender. George, still looking at the fallen old man's body, turned triumphantly, ready to claim his prize and eliminate Mary once and for all. But he stopped. The expression on his face changed from victory to confusion. The safe was open, but it didn't contain what he expected. There were no bags of gold, no stacks of old money, no glittering jewels. Mary also looked on, her hands still gripping the hammer, not understanding. Inside the safe were only papers, thick documents rolled in waxed leather, tied with twine, perfectly preserved by the metal seal. Papers? George spat the word with a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. He had killed a man for old documents? Where's the gold, you witch? Where did you hide it? He took a step forward. The barrel of the revolver rising again, this time pointed directly at Mary's heart. His henchmen also seemed confused, relaxing their posture a little. They had come for fortune, not for old courthouse records. The immediate danger seemed to have lessened, replaced by the disappointment of a frustrated thief. But Mary wasn't looking at George. She was looking at the documents in her hands. With trembling, bloodied fingers, she unrolled the waxed leather. The papers were heavy, the parchment thick and flexible, perfectly preserved by the oiled leather. She saw red wax seals still intact, elaborate signatures in black ink that time had not managed to erase, official stamps from the Arizona desert government. They were legal, important documents. The colonel wasn't fleeing with his gold. He was fleeing with his power, with proof of what he possessed. Mary's hands trembled so much that she could barely hold the papers as she turned the first page. Her eyes, now accustomed to the gloom and sharpened by the adrenaline rushing through her veins, fixed on a name she knew as well as her own children's names. At the top of the bundle, fastened with a blue wax seal, was the main document. Deed of property, she read softly, the words coming out with difficulty because Mary barely knew how to read, having only studied until 2nd grade. But those words she knew. She had seen them on papers Ronald carefully kept. And below, Goodview Ranch and adjacent lands, a remote town in the Arizona desert. It was the land George claimed as his, the land where Ronald had worked until died, the land from which she had been expelled like a trespasser. Mary's eyes frantically scanned the document, searching. She saw the name of the original colonel, a certain Francis Alastair Sampson, dated 1952. And then, in a clear transfer of rights registered with the county clerk's office, dated 1998, she saw the sale of that property. Not to the cooperative, not to George, to Ronald Joseph Fisher, Mr. Ronald, for $15,000, paid in installments over 5 years, all settled and stamped. The last installment had been paid in January 2003, a year and a half ago. The revelation hit her with the force of a truck. George had not only lied about the debt, he had lied about everything. The house did not belong to the cooperative. The land was not his. Ronald didn't owe money. Ronald was the owner. He had bought that property with the sweat of his own labor, installment by installment, for 5 years. And George knew. He must have known. He had expelled Mary not because of a debt that didn't exist, but to steal her and the children's legitimate inheritance. He thought the proof of this ownership had disappeared forever in this forgotten train, that no one would ever know the truth. There were more documents. Mary continued to flip through with fingers that wouldn't stop bleeding. Titles to other smaller properties in the region, all transferred to Ronald, registration certificates in his name. And at the bottom of the stack, something even more valuable, lease agreements for the very quarry where Ronald died. The quarry did not belong to the cooperative. It belonged to Ronald, who had bought the mineral exploration rights along with the land. George was just the manager, the employee. But after Ronald's death, with no one to contest it, George had simply taken everything, had falsified the history, had invented debts, had stolen an entire empire. George, seeing that Mary wasn't responding, seeing the way she looked at those papers, felt fear begin to rise in his throat. He took a step forward and grabbed her arm forcefully, trying to snatch the documents. "Give me that!" But when his own eyes fell upon the paper she held, when he saw the seal of the county clerk's office, when he recognized the signature of Notary Miller, who still worked in a remote town in the Arizona desert, the blood drained from his face. He turned white as a sheet. He knew exactly what those papers meant. His entire facade, built on his brother's death and his family's misery, had crumbled in a single instant. The power in the car changed hands as quickly as a gunshot. Mary didn't scream, didn't accuse him with words. She didn't need to. She simply stood there, with George's arm still squeezing hers, and looked at him. She held the papers high, a parchment shield worth more than any weapon. In her other hand, the bloody hammer still hung heavy. Her posture changed completely. She straightened up, and for the first time in days, the weight of widowhood and hunger seemed to lift from her shoulders. She was no longer a victim hidden in an abandoned car. She was the owner of the land George was standing on. The henchman at the door noticed the change. They saw the terror on their boss's face and grew nervous, exchanging glances. They had come to intimidate a defenseless widow, not to face a woman with legal documents that destroyed everything. In the desert, land was everything. A revolver could kill, but those papers could destroy entire generations, erase names, ruin families. And Mary held them in her hands. "This land," Mary said, and her voice echoed in the metal shell with an authority she didn't even know she possessed, "is mine. The house you expelled me from, the well, the quarry, everything." Each word was a stone being laid, building a wall between her and the man who had tried to destroy her. She looked at the henchman at the door. "It belongs to my children." She pointed to the children who watched with wide eyes, sensing the turn but not fully understanding. Everything that was Ronald's now belongs to them. George released her as if her skin burned. His mind worked desperately. He could kill her now, shoot her and the 6 children, set the car on fire and make everything disappear. But his men had seen. They had seen the documents. They had heard her claim. Killing an unprotected widow was one thing, but killing her now, with illegal proof in hand, in front of witnesses, would be to admit the crime of theft and add multiple murder. He couldn't trust their loyalty for such a desperate and brutal act. The law, even far away and corrupt as it was, still respected documents from the county clerk's office above all else. He was cornered. Slowly, costing every ounce of pride he had, George lowered his revolver. His hand trembled with suppressed rage. He looked at the papers, then Mary's impassive face, then the old man's body on the floor, a guardian who had fulfilled his last mission without knowing it. Without saying a word, he put the gun back in its holster. He turned his back and pushed his own men out of the car. He didn't run, but it was the walk of someone defeated. The pickup truck sped off, raising clouds of red dust that took a long time to settle. When the last sound of the engines died in the distance, the silence that fell over the car was different from any other. It was no longer the silence of abandonment or terror. It was the silence of waiting, of what comes next. Mary stood motionless for a long moment, feeling the weight of the documents in her hand. They were heavier than the hammer, hotter than the metal in the sun. They burned with a power she barely understood, but felt at her bleeding fingertips. She looked at her children huddled against the wall, their dirty, thin faces fixed on her, waiting for guidance. She had won a battle, but the war for survival continued. Julia still had a fever. They still had no food. They were still trapped in a train car in the middle of nowhere. Victory was just ink and paper if she couldn't save her daughter, and time was running out. The first act was to care for the guardian. The old man lay on the dusty floor, his useless knife still clutched in his rigid hand. Mary approached and, with a gentleness that contrasted with the violence of the previous minutes, closed his eyes with 2 fingers. She took her own shawl, the only piece of cloth that still had some sentimental value because it had been a wedding gift from Ronald, and covered the man's face. "Rest," she whispered. "You did more for us than any saint." Daniel came and stood beside his mother, looking at the body. In his face, still childlike but aged by the ordeal, Mary saw the understanding that this stranger had bought their future with his last breath. She returned to the strongbox. The property documents were on top, but there was more underneath. Carefully, she took out the rest. They weren't just deeds. There were policies from the Bank of America, yellowed but valid, stock certificates from the regional cooperative. Ironically, the shares George claimed to own. Receipts for gold deposits made at the Bank of Arizona in 1954, never redeemed. It was a sleeping fortune, a power that depended not only on the land, but on the world outside. But that world was hundreds of miles away, on the other side of a desert that would kill her before she took 100 steps. Julia's fever was the only enemy that mattered now, an enemy faster and crueler than George. Mary had the wealth of the world bleeding between her fingers and couldn't buy a bottle of Tylenol. The frustration made her cry again, hot tears of impotence falling onto the documents. But then her eyes fell on the other object, the one she had discarded as useless, the brass binoculars. Why would a colonel keep binoculars with his most precious documents? It wasn't an ornament, it was a tool. By impulse, Mary Fisher grabbed the binoculars and stepped out of the wagon, climbing the rusted ladder to the curved roof. The metal burned under the afternoon sun, but she didn't feel it. She stood, a tiny dot on the iron monster, and raised the binoculars to her eyes. At first, she saw only the immensity of the desert, an expanse of brown and dry green stretching as far as the eye could see. She saw George's cooperative in the distance, a complex of white buildings. She saw the smoke from the quarry staining the sky. But then, following the dead line of the tracks eastward, far in the distance where the horizon curved, she saw something else. A different wisp of smoke, black and thick, moving. It wasn't a fire, it was a locomotive. It was the main railway line that was still active, the artery connecting the desert to the rest of the country. A plan was born, not of hope, but of cold logic. She couldn't walk to the city, couldn't cross the desert with 6 children and a dying baby. She couldn't go back to the settlement, which was George's territory. But perhaps she didn't need to go to civilization. Perhaps she could bring civilization to her. With the binoculars, she scanned the closer horizon. There, about 4 kilometers in the opposite direction, in a fold of the terrain invisible from the ground, she saw a small homestead. There was a wooden shack, a corral with goats, and the thin smoke of a wood-burning stove. They were people. Marginalized like her, but they were people. She climbed down from the roof, her decision made. She wasn't going to run. Running was what George expected. She wasn't going back to the ranch yet. That place was too stained by lies and blood. This train, this iron coffin, had been her refuge and her revelation. Here she would stay. This was her territory now. She turned to Daniel. "Son, you're going to that homestead over there." She handed him not a document, but the only thing of immediate value she had found loose at the bottom of the safe. 2 heavy, genuine $20 gold coins that must have rolled out of a torn bag. Tell the people there that a mother needs help, that she'll pay for medicine for a child's fever, that she'll pay for food, bring whatever you can get." Daniel, at 13 years old, nodded without hesitation. He took the coins, tied a cloth around his head to protect himself from the sun, and disappeared running into the desert, moving fast and low among the scrub bushes. Mary Fisher spent the next hours in the hell of waiting. Every minute was torture. What if Daniel got lost? What if the homestead people were hostile? What if they were friends of George? What if he came back empty-handed? She held Julia against her chest, singing songs that came out broken from her dry throat, wiping the sweat that beaded on the baby's burning forehead, praying prayers that seemed to reach no sky. The sun was low, tinging everything blood red when Daniel finally reappeared. He wasn't alone. Behind him walked a woman, not old, but looking old, stooped by work. She wasn't from the homestead. She was from even further away, a medicine woman whom the homestead people had galloped to fetch when Daniel appeared with gold in his hand. She didn't speak. She entered the wagon, looked at Julia for a long moment, then looked at Mary Fisher and nodded once. From her worn cloth bag, she took out dried herbs tied in bundles, dark roots that looked like twisted fingers, and a small vial with brown liquid. She began to work in silence, murmuring words that Mary Fisher didn't understand. They sounded like a prayer, but weren't Portuguese. She crushed the herbs with a stone, mixed them with water that Daniel had brought in a bottle, and made a bitter tea that smelled of earth. She made Mary Fisher give the liquid to Julia drop by drop, forcing the baby to swallow. She made poultices of red clay mixed with macerated leaves and applied them to the child's chest and forehead. The medicine woman stayed all night. She worked without stopping, changing the poultices every hour, giving more tea, praying words that created a hypnotic rhythm filling the wagon. Mary Fisher didn't sleep, only watched, holding Julia's hand, feeling the too-fast pulse beneath the thin skin. When dawn finally came, when the first rays of sun entered through the broken windows, the miracle had happened. The fever had broken. Julia was sweating profusely, soaking her blanket, but her skin no longer burned. When she opened her little eyes, they were clear and focused, and she sought her mother's breast with her tiny mouth. Mary Fisher collapsed in sobs, a relief so profound it almost knocked her over. The medicine woman simply packed her things. Mary Fisher offered the 2 coins, but the woman refused. She took only the pliers from the toolbox, as if that were fair payment, and disappeared into the desert from where she had come, an unlikely angel dressed in a faded calico dress. With Julia saved, Mary Fisher could finally think clearly. She had the documents, she had irrefutable proof, but she was still trapped in a wagon, still vulnerable. George wouldn't give up. He would return with more men, with a better plan. She had to act fast. She remembered the binoculars, the active railway she had seen. That was the way out. But she had to do things in the right order. First, she buried the guardian decently. With the help of Daniel and Camilla, they dug a grave in the shadow of the locomotive, using the rusted shovel they found. There was no wood for a cross, so they piled stones to form a mound. Mary Fisher stood beside it and, for the first time in days, truly prayed. Not for distant saints, but for that man who, in his madness, had been more human than the entire settlement. Then she organized the wagon. She cleaned it as best she could, created sleeping spaces, and cataloged everything she had. The documents were carefully rewrapped in wax leather and hidden in a new place only she knew. It was her life insurance. She rationed the food Daniel had brought from the homestead: cornmeal, a block of brown sugar, jerky. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a few days if she was careful. On the 3rd day after George's visit, Mary Fisher made her decision. Early in the morning, she climbed onto the wagon roof with the binoculars and observed. The active railway passed one train a day, always at the same time in the afternoon. She saw the pattern. She climbed down and wrote a letter, with Daniel's help as he wrote better. It was addressed to the judge in a remote town in the Arizona desert, to the sheriff, to the district attorney. She explained who she was, what had happened, what she had found. She asked for legal protection, asking them to come to her because she couldn't go to them. She put the letter in an improvised envelope made of paper tied with string. The next day, when she heard the distant train whistle, Mary Fisher ran. She ran through the desert with Daniel towards the active tracks, carrying an improvised flag made from her mother's red shawl tied to a branch. They reached the line when the train was still a kilometer away. They stood on the line, waving frantically. The engineer saw them, honked irritably, but stopped. It was against the rules, but the sight of a woman and a child in the middle of nowhere, thin and desperate, stirred something within him. Mary Fisher handed him the letter and one of the bank policies as payment, begging him to deliver it in the city. The engineer, a 50-year-old man who had seen much misery in his life, looked into her eyes and saw something that made him accept. He carefully put away the letter. "I'll deliver it personally," he promised, and he kept his word. 4 days later, when Mary Fisher had almost lost hope, she heard the sound of cars approaching. The terror returned. Would it be George with more men? But it wasn't. It was an official delegation. The judge had come personally, accompanied by the sheriff, a county clerk, and 2 police officers. They had come because the policy she sent was genuine, valuable enough to spark interest. They had come because the story was too serious to ignore. Mary Fisher showed them the documents. The county clerk examined them for hours, checking seals, signatures, records. Everything was in order. Everything was legitimate. The judge, a serious man with thick glasses, listened to her story. He heard about the expulsion, about George's lies, about Ronald's death. He ordered an immediate investigation. 3 days later, George was arrested trying to flee to New Mexico. The frauds were uncovered one after another. He had stolen not only from Mary, but from other widows, from other dead workers. His empire crumbled like a sandcastle. Mary didn't go back to the old house. She didn't want to. With the money from the redeemed policies, she built a new house on the farm, far from where Ronald had died. She renovated the quarry, put honest managers in charge, and created safety rules. The business prospered. Her children grew up, studied, some went to the city, others stayed to care for the land. But Mary never forgot the train car. Once a month, until the end of her life, she went back there. She brought flowers for the guardian's grave. She sat inside the iron car, in the spot where she had hammered the safe until her hands bled. And she remembered. She remembered that the most powerful strength that exists doesn't come from documents or money. It comes from a mother who refuses to give up. It comes from the courage to pick up a hammer when you have nothing left. It comes from knowing that as long as you can raise your arm one more time, there is still hope. Years later, when asked why she kept that abandoned train instead of selling the scrap metal, "That's not a cemetery, it's a monument. It's where I died as a victim and was reborn as a fighter. It's where I learned that a rusty piece of iron can be a palace if you have enough faith. It's where God showed me that He doesn't save us from suffering, but gives us the tools to save ourselves." The train car is still there, in the same place, now preserved and painted. It became a local tourist spot. People visit, take photos, read the plaque that tells the summarized story. But no plaque can capture what really happened there. No words can describe the sound of the hammer against the iron, hour after hour. No photo shows the bleeding hands. No tour explains the taste of despair or the weight of hope when it finally returns. Before you go, I want to ask you a special favor. If this story touched your heart in any way, If you saw a piece of your own struggle in Mary's journey, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. But more important than that, share your story here in the comments. What was your iron train car? What was that moment when you had to pick up your hammer and fight against what seemed impossible? What did you learn about yourself when you were at rock bottom? Because, you see, Mary's story isn't just hers, it's ours too. Each of us has our own abandoned train cars, our own locked safes, our own moments when we need to decide if we're going to give up or if we're going to raise the hammer one more time. And knowing that we're not alone in this fight makes all the difference. When you share your story, you become someone's guardian. You become the medicine woman who appears when no one else comes. You become proof that it's possible to survive and even prosper after the impossible. So tell us, what did you take from this story? What will you carry into your day? How will you use this strength when your own desert seems insurmountable? The community here is waiting to hear you, to support you, to celebrate your victories and give you strength in your battles. Because in the end, no one wins alone. Mary had her children, she had the crazy guardian, she had the medicine woman, and you have us. See you in the next story. The years that followed, the lawsuit against George dragged on for 18 months in the courts of a remote town in the Arizona desert. There were months of back and forth, of exhausting hearings, where Mary had to relive the expulsion, the walk through the desert, Julia's fever. Each time she told the story, it was like opening a wound that had barely begun to heal. But she did not falter. She appeared at each hearing with the same documents wrapped in waxed leather, now kept in a new leather folder, but she insisted on keeping the original wrapper as a reminder of where it all began. George tried everything. He hired expensive lawyers from the Capitol, paid with money he had stolen over the years. He claimed the documents were fake, that they had been planted, that Mary was an opportunistic swindler. He bought witnesses who swore they had seen Ronald sign debt papers. But the truth had a strength that lies could not overcome. The county clerk who had registered the original sale to Ronald was still alive, an 83-year-old man with an elephant's memory, and he testified, not only recognizing the documents, but remembering the exact day Ronald had appeared at the county clerk's office to make the final payment, smiling from ear to ear, because he finally owned his own land. The investigation revealed things worse than Mary imagined. George had a pattern. Over the past 12 years, 7 workers had died in accidents at the quarry, all of them owners of small plots that were magically incorporated into the cooperative soon after their deaths. The widows had been expelled, intimidated. Some had simply disappeared from the county. There were entire families that had been erased from the map. Ronald's accident had not been an accident. Witnesses finally came forward, protected by the presence of the law, recounting that they had seen George order the support beams of a section of the mine to be removed, knowing that Ronald would work there the next day. It was premeditated murder. When the sentence finally came down, George was sentenced to 28 years in prison for homicide, fraud, theft, document forgery, and a list of crimes that filled 3 pages. All the properties he had stolen were returned to the legitimate families. But for many of these families, victory came too late. Of the 7 widows he had stolen from, only 3 were still alive. The others had died in poverty, in distant cities where they had fled, or had simply disappeared without a trace. Their children, scattered and lost, never knew they were entitled to anything more than the poverty they inherited. Mary became, unintentionally, a kind of local heroine. The people who had closed their doors when she passed by asking for help now wanted to be her friends, wanted to be associated with the woman who had overthrown the tyrant. She wasn't angry with them, not exactly. She understood the fear. She understood the need for survival that makes good people do nothing. But she also didn't forget. She kept an polite distance, did business when necessary, but never truly let those people into her life. Her family was now different, composed of those who had helped when helping was dangerous. The medicine woman who saved Julia became a constant presence. Her name was Sabrina. She was 62 years old and lived alone in a shack 15 miles from anywhere. Mary built a small but dignified house for her on the homestead, offering a place where she could grow old comfortably. Sabrina accepted, but with conditions. "I'm not an employee, I'm not a dependent, I'm a partner," she said with that raspy voice of someone who had smoked their whole life. "I'll take care of the children when they get sick. I'll bless whoever needs it, but I won't clean anyone's bathroom or cook lunch for the boss," Mary agreed, smiling. It was exactly the kind of arrangement she wanted. The folks from the homestead who had gone to fetch Sabrina were also rewarded. Ma Mary Fisher bought their homestead, which was mortgaged and about to be repossessed by the bank, and transferred the deed back to them, free of debt. She didn't want thanks, she didn't want flattery, she just wanted to pay her debt. "You helped me when I had nothing, when helping me could have cost you your lives," she said the day she handed over the documents. "That's not something you forget. It's not something you can repay, but we try." Daniel, the eldest son, grew up carrying the weight of having been the man of the family when he was only 13. Mary Fisher saw the excessive seriousness in him, saw how he didn't play like other children his age, how he took on responsibilities that weren't his. She tried to convince him to be a child while he still could, but Daniel had seen too much, had held his siblings' hands on the trek through the desert, had run alone through the desert to find help. There was no erasing that. At 18, he announced he wanted to study mining engineering. "I'm going to learn to do it the right way," he said. "I'm going to make sure no worker dies because the boss cut corners on safety." Mary Fisher paid for his college at a university in Phoenix. He graduated at the top of his class. Camilla, the second oldest, had a different path. The experience in the boxcar had marked her in another way. She remembered the sounds of the night, the animals circling, the cold that seeped through the cracks. She developed fears she hadn't had before. Fear of the dark, fear of enclosed spaces, constant nightmares. Mary Fisher took her to doctors in the capital, to psychologists when she discovered they existed. It took years of therapy, but Camilla slowly recovered. She decided to study psychology, wanting to help other children who went through trauma. "The boxcar broke me," she once told her mother, now an adult. "But I learned that broken things can be fixed. It just takes patience and the right tools." She opened a clinic in a remote town in the Arizona desert that served poor families for free. Gabriel, Lucas, and Beatrice, the three middle children, were too young to remember many details. They had fragmented memories, the feeling of hunger, the cold metal, their mother's voice singing in the darkness. They grew up lighter than their older siblings, without carrying as much weight. Gabriel became a teacher. Lucas followed his father, becoming the owner of a small auto repair shop. Beatrice married young and had 5 children who filled the ranch with noise and life. Julia, the baby who almost died of fever, didn't consciously remember anything. But there was something in her, a deep gratitude for life that the other children didn't have. She saw beauty in simple things, a sunset, a bird singing, the rain falling. "It's because you've been so close to losing everything that you now value every moment," Sabrina once said, watching the 8-year-old girl dance in the rain. Julia grew up and became an artist, a painter, her canvases vibrant with color and life. Her first exhibition was called Fever, a series of abstract paintings in reds and oranges that somehow captured the feeling of being between life and death. One of the canvases was bought by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The ranch prospered under Mary Fisher's management, but not in the way everyone expected. She did not become a rich and distant rancher. She transformed the property into a true cooperative, not the sham that George had created. She distributed land to the workers, created a profit-sharing system, built a school for employees' children, a health clinic, and a daycare. "I know what it's like to have nothing," she explained when other ranchers criticized her model as being too generous, unsustainable. "I know what it's like to be evicted, to starve, to see a child dying because there's no medicine. I won't do that to anyone, never." The quarry was completely renovated. Daniel, after graduating, returned and redesigned the entire safety system. He installed imported steel beams, modern ventilation systems, and personal protective equipment for all workers. The cost was high, profits decreased in the short term, but accidents dropped to zero. "My father died because someone decided his life was worth less than the cost of a decent beam," Daniel said at the inauguration of the new system. "Here, no life is worth less than profit, never." But not everything was easy or pleasant in the years that followed. Mary Fisher faced resistance from the ranching community. She was called a communist, crazy, an ingrate who was spoiling the workers and creating unrealistic expectations. Some tried to boycott her products, refusing to buy from the cooperative. She found alternative markets, selling directly to the capital, creating a brand that valued ethical production. Fairstone, that was the brand name. It sold for more, but there was a market for it because people were starting to care about where the things they bought came from. There were also threats. George had friends, he had family, he had allies who didn't forget. Twice they tried to burn down her new house. Once they shot at Mary Fisher's bedroom window, the bullet passing inches from the pillow where she slept. She hired security, installed fences, but refused to live in fear. "I already spent 3 days thinking I would die in the desert," she would say. "If I survive that, no one is going to scare me with threats from a cowardly man who shoots from afar." The worst attack came 5 years after George's conviction. It was coordinated, professional. 6 masked men invaded the ranch on a moonless night, armed with rifles and machetes. They were there to kill Mary Fisher and burn all the documents, to erase everything she had built. But they underestimated 2 things. First, that the entire ranch had been on alert since the previous threats, with an improvised but effective surveillance system. Second, that Mary Fisher's workers weren't scared employees. They were partners who defended what was theirs too. The battle lasted 20 minutes. The invaders were met not by a lone woman, but by 30 men and women armed with what they had: hoes, sickles, old hunting shotguns, rocks. Daniel, who was visiting, organized the defense with the precision of a general. When the police finally arrived, drawn by the gunshots, they found 3 invaders tied up in the yard. 2 had fled, and 1 was dead. Not from violence by the ranch, but because he tripped over his own greed and fell into a ditch. "They're breaking his neck." The investigation revealed that the attack had been financed by a consortium of 3 local ranchers who saw Mary Fisher as a threat to the status quo. They were arrested, tried, and convicted. Their imprisonment sent a message: times had changed. They could no longer do as they pleased with the weak just because they had power. There was law now. There were consequences. Mary Fisher had forced this change simply by refusing to be a victim. The years passed, and the wounds healed, leaving scars that reminded but no longer hurt as much. Mary Fisher aged slowly, her hair turning gray, her body growing thinner but still strong. She never married again. She had suitors, good men who courted her with respect, but she always gently refused. "My heart was given once," she explained. "Ronald took it with him when he left. It's okay, I've learned to live with the empty space. There are worse things than loneliness." But she wasn't truly alone. She had her children, her grandchildren, who began to arrive, the ranch full of life and noise. She had Sabrina, who aged alongside her, the two of them sitting on the porch every afternoon to drink coffee and complain about their backaches. She had the workers who became family, whose children called her Aunt Mary Fisher or simply Miss Mary. And there was the boxcar, always the boxcar. Once a month, religiously, Mary Fisher made the trek, until then. At first, it was a difficult journey, 2.5 miles through the desert. Over time, she built a dirt road that made access easier. But even as she grew older and could have sent someone to clean and care for the place, she insisted on going herself. The ritual never changed. She arrived early in the morning, before the sun was too high. First, she visited the guardian's grave, which now had a decent wooden cross and fresh flowers she planted herself around it. She would stay there for a few minutes in silence, sometimes speaking softly, sharing news, giving thanks. "Another month, old man," she'd say. "Still here, still fighting." Then she would enter the boxcar. Over the years, she had made minimal improvements. She cleaned it, added some wooden benches, boarded up the broken windows during storms. But she kept the essence of the place intact. Rust still covered the walls, the metal floor still bore the stains that never came out. And there, in that corner where she had pounded on the safe until her hands bled, she would sit. Sometimes she would take her grandchildren. The older ones learned the full story, sitting on the same metal floor where their parents had almost starved to death. Mary Fisher didn't romanticize, didn't soften it. She told everything: the despair, the fear, the gnawing hunger, the certainty of death. "I want you to know," she would say, "that the strength you carry didn't come from nowhere. It came from that moment when your grandmother decided she wouldn't let you die. It came from your parents, who were children but walked through the desert without complaining. It came from that crazy old man who died defending people he barely knew. That strength is in your blood now. Use it for good." In 2019, when Mary Fisher turned 69, the mayor's office of a remote town in the Arizona desert finally officially recognized the boxcar as a historical landmark. They held a ceremony, called the press from Phoenix and even New York, wanting to turn it into a major tourist attraction. Mary Fisher agreed, but with conditions. "I don't want a sterilized museum," she said to the mayor. "I want people to feel what was real. I want them to see the rust, feel the heat, imagine the cold. I want them to understand that desperate places exist, that people still go through this today, and that the only way to survive is not to give up, even when giving up seems like the only logical option." They installed a modest plaque at the entrance of the boxcar. It didn't tell the whole story. It would be impossible to capture everything in words, but it stated the essential. In this boxcar, in August 2004, a woman named Mary Fisher and her 6 children found refuge after being unjustly expelled from their home. Here, on the brink of survival, facing hunger, disease, and violence, she discovered documents that proved her right to stolen land and the truth about her husband's murder. This place is a monument not to easy victory, but to brutal persistence. It is a reminder that justice sometimes has to be torn out with one's own bleeding hands. It is proof that no place is so abandoned that it cannot become a palace for those who need one. May all who enter here know you are stronger than you imagine, and sometimes all you need to survive is the courage to raise the hammer one more time. The boxcar became an unlikely pilgrimage site. Not just curious tourists, but real people who were going through their own hells. Widows who had lost everything. Single mothers struggling to raise children alone. Workers who had been cheated by their bosses. They would go there, sit on the rusty metal floor, and somehow find the strength to carry on. Mary Fisher received letters from them, hundreds over the years, telling their stories, thanking her for the inspiration. One letter in particular she kept until the end. It was from a woman from Oklahoma, also named Mary Fisher, also a widow, who was about to give up a legal battle against the government that had taken her land for a dam. "I was ready to quit," she wrote, "too tired, too poor, too defeated. But then I read about you and the boxcar, and I thought, if a woman managed to open an iron safe with her bare hands to save her children, I can at least keep trying. I don't know if I'll win, but now I know I won't give up." 3 years later, that woman sent another letter. She had won. The government had been forced to pay fair compensation. She had bought new, better land. She was rebuilding. Mary Fisher read these letters on the porch with Sabrina, and sometimes she cried. "Why am I crying?" she would ask, annoyed with herself. "These are happy stories." And Sabrina, who was over 90 but still had a mind sharp as a blade, always answered the same thing. "You cry because you finally understood. It wasn't just about you. It was never just about you. It was about showing the way. It was about being proof that survival is possible. You became the crazy guardian for other people, that invisible presence that appears when all seems lost and shows that there is still a fight left." In October 2023, Mary Fisher was diagnosed with cancer. It was advanced, aggressive, and at 73, her body was no longer strong enough to endure the heavy treatments. The doctors gave her 6 months, perhaps less. She refused chemotherapy. "I'm not going to spend my last months vomiting and losing my hair," she told her crying children. "I've been through enough deprivation in this life. I'm going to die my way, lucid, whole, deciding my last things." She spent her last 5 months putting everything in order. She officially divided the ranch among the workers, creating a true cooperative system that would last for generations. She recorded videos for each grandchild, personalized advice based on what she knew about each one. She wrote a detailed will, not just about material possessions, but about values, about what she wanted her family to represent. And she spent her last days in the boxcar. Against all her children's protests, against the pleas of doctors who said she needed to be in a hospital, Mary Fisher insisted. She had a bed placed in the boxcar, they brought portable oxygen when she started having trouble breathing, and there she stayed. Her children took turns staying with her, sometimes all together, filling the boxcar with voices and life just like that first terrible night in 2004. "Why do you want to be here?" Julia asked, holding her mother's skeletal hand. "This place has so many bad memories. Why not at home, in your comfortable bed?" Mary Fisher smiled, that slow smile that lit up her face even consumed by illness. "Because it was here that I learned who I really was," she said, her voice weak but firm. "It was here that I died as the frightened woman and was reborn as the strong woman. I want to finish where I started. It makes sense." On the last night, everyone was there. Her 6 children, now middle-aged adults, some with gray hair of their own. Her 17 grandchildren, her 5 great-grandchildren. Sabrina, who at 94 insisted on being present, even if it meant risking her own fragile health. Not everyone could fit inside the boxcar, so some stayed outside in the cool March night, looking at the stars. Mary Fisher was lying on the makeshift bed, covered with the same shawl that had covered the guardian. Her breathing was labored, irregular, but she was conscious, present. She looked at each face, memorizing, saying goodbye. "Don't be sad," she said when Camilla started to sob. "I had a good life. It wasn't easy, it wasn't always happy, but it was mine. I chose every step after this. I won. George is rotting in a prison cell. I'm surrounded by 3 generations of love. Who won?" Daniel, the eldest son who bore the same name as the 13-year-old boy who had run through the desert to find help, held his mother's hand. "You, Mom, you won. You always won." Mary squeezed his hand with the little strength she had. No, we won. It was always us. I wouldn't have survived without you being my reason. You wouldn't have survived without me being too stubborn to give up. It was teamwork from day one. At 12 minutes past midnight, Mary Fisher passed away. Her breathing simply stopped, soft as her dozing off. There was no dramatic struggle, no movie scene. It was peace. Julia, who was holding one hand, and Daniel, who held the other, felt the exact moment. "She's gone," Daniel whispered, and the crying began. But it wasn't just sadness. It was gratitude, too, relief that she hadn't suffered anymore, pride in who she had been. The funeral was 3 days later, the biggest a remote town in the Arizona desert had ever seen. Not because Mary was rich, though she was, not because she was famous, though she was locally, but because she had touched lives. The families of the workers came, 3 generations of them. The other widows she had helped reclaim their land after George's case came. People came from other states, people who only knew the story but felt they should be present. The procession passed by the boxcar before going to the cemetery, a final visit. They buried Mary in the small ranch cemetery she had created, next to where Ronald had been buried when they finally recovered his body from the quarry years later. The headstone was simple: Mary Santos Fisher, 1950-2023. She raised the hammer. Nothing else was needed. Those who knew understood. Those who didn't know could ask and learn. But the story didn't end there. Stories like this never completely end. The boxcar continues, now part of a historical tourism circuit of the desert. Thousands visit each year. The ranch continues, now managed by a council elected by the workers themselves. Fairstone grew, becoming one of the largest suppliers of ethical stones in the Southwest, internationally certified. Mary's children go on with their lives, each carrying a piece of her legacy. Daniel developed mining safety technologies that saved countless lives. Camilla treated hundreds of traumatized children, passing on the healing she herself received. Gabriel educated generations of students with the same dedication his mother had. Lucas created honest jobs. Beatrice raised a family that understands the value of love. And Julia continues painting, her works now nationally recognized. Each canvas a celebration of survival. But perhaps Mary's most important legacy is not measured in land, money, or recognition. It is measured in the stories people tell. In kitchen conversations where mothers tell daughters, "Do you know the story of Mary of the boxcar? If she could do it, you can too." In moments of despair when someone thinks of giving up but remembers, "She hammered that safe until her hands bled. I can try one more time." It is measured in the times when someone, anywhere, picks up their own metaphorical hammer, be it a pen, a phone, a lawsuit, a difficult conversation, a no where before there was only yes, and decides not to accept injustice silently. That they will fight even when it seems impossible. That they will survive even when survival seems improbable. The boxcar is still there, rusty and crooked, an iron monument to human resilience. People still visit, still sit on the cold floor, still feel the presence of something greater. It's not a beautiful place. It's not comfortable, but it's real. It's honest. It's a reminder that life's worst moments can become the foundation for the best. And when the wind blows through the broken windows of the boxcar, making that whistling sound that scared children decades ago, some people swear they can still hear, very faintly, the sound of the hammer against the iron. Thump, 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 thump. The sound of a mother refusing to give up. The sound of hope being forged in metal. The sound that says, "Get up. Try again. You are stronger than you think." And that's why Mary's story matters. Not because she was a superheroine, but because she was human, broken, desperate. And yet she kept going because she proved that the greatest strength comes not from never falling, but from always getting up. Because she showed that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply refuse to die when the world has decided you should. Her hammer is on display in the boxcar now, placed in a simple glass case. The handle still has dark stains that could be blood or rust. No one wants to clean it to find out. The iron head still shows the marks of hundreds of blows. It's not a sacred relic, it's a tool, and the small plaque next to it simply says, "Available for emergencies." Because the truth is this: we all eventually find our own iron boxcar. We all face our own safe locked with salvation inside, but no key. And when that moment comes, when you are kneeling on the cold floor with bleeding hands and hope almost gone, remember Mary. Pick up your hammer and hit it again. Just one more time, and one more, until the door opens.